and gentlemen,
can I please have your attention? Can you dig it?
Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. Very excited to have a return guest, AI colleague, one who goes to greater depths of eggheadery than I am capable of, and so I'm delighted to have him here to broaden and deepen my own eggheadery. I mean, none other than Tony Mills, senior fellow at AI, who covers what is your portfolio? It's like, explain to people what your portfolio is.
Sure. Yeah, my primary beat is science policy, sort of broadly construed, but I also write a lot about political theory and the role of expertise and democracy, and so kind of in a relationship between political philosophy and theory and science.
All right, so this is because I am nothing if not a master of the segue. What is the role of expertise in liberal society, and where is its intersection with politics and philosophy? Seriously, like what like you recently wrote about something for the Dispatch on this, about when you're writing about Fukuyama and whatnot, like, and there's and I've been guilty of it from time to time over the years. I bristle at the cult of expertise, and I think there's a healthy thing in the American political tradition of being skeptical of expertise while at the same time loving experts on specific things. Like, when we start there, where does that come from in the in the American political tradition, where we are simultaneously all into technological advancement? We really love practicality, pragmatism properly understood, and yet at the same time we bristle at the idea that there's somebody who can tell us how to do it their way rather than our way.
Yeah, well, so your first formulation of the question, your second formulation of the question sort of tees up what was going to be my answer to the first formulation of it. So, I think if we think about, we talk a lot about the crisis of liberalism, sort of broad political crisis where we're concerned about, liberal democratic regimes and, both within the United States and globally. Simultaneously, we have a crisis of scientific authority, which, certainly was heightened or exacerbated during the coronavirus crisis, but I think predates that. And in certain respects, you can trace it, as far back as you want, as I think we're kind of alluding to. And a lot of what I write about is trying to bring these two crises sort of to draw connections between them. I think in a certain sense, they are the same crisis, although we don't always think of them that way. And so I guess it's sort of a first pass. The way I think about it is that, maybe two ways to think about it. One is that one of the issues at stake in the crisis of liberalism, the rise of populism, is the status of elites. And something that happened over the course of American history is the rise of a new kind of elite, an expert elite, something we could really date to the late 19th century, and the integration of that expert elite into the affairs of government, especially in the 20th century. And so I think in a lot of respects, the debates over liberalism, elites, and populism are very closely intertwined with the status of experts as elites. And the second piece, which is related, is that if we think about the tradition of American, the American political tradition as rooted in an ideal of self-governance, then expertise poses an interesting challenge, at least prima facie kind of challenge to that ideal. There's always been a tension between, the few and the many in political philosophy and in political organizations. And there's also always been a tension between, going back to Plato, the philosophers, the few who know, and the many who don't. I think what happens with the rise in the late 19th century of this kind of scientific technical elite is a peculiarly modern form of that problem, where experts who are increasingly specialized and increasingly reliant on technical skill sets become necessary for the functioning of modern society, for functioning of government, but also all other aspects of society. And yet, because that knowledge is by nature specialized and technical, it precludes the many. It even precludes other technical experts, which is a implication that is too infrequently recognized. And so, putting it very simply, you have a challenge to the notion that we can be self-governing citizens if we're increasingly interdependent on people whose expertise we don't have access to do governance. And so I think grappling with that problem is one of the most important things that we can. I mean, we are grappling with it as a sort of a matter of fact. And I think really getting clear about it and trying to think about the extent to which expertise poses a problem with self-governance, and if not, how those two things can be reconciled. That's something that's really urgent today.
Okay, I have thoughts. One, when I was talking about this trait of American culture, I wish I could remember the name of the general, but the Revolutions podcast, which I loved, their series on the American Revolution has this story about how the Americans brought in some Hessian or German or French general to help advise the colonial troops, the revolutionary troops. And he came in with all of these modern European professional military techniques about how to march, how to get in formation, how to do this, how to ford a river, blah, 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 blah. And I just remember Mike Duncan, who was the host of the thing, pointing out that at first the Americans refused to do any of it. And then the military, liaison European guy realized that if he explained to them why they should do it, they were perfectly happy to learn the thing, right? But they would always ask, why do we need, it was like the kids in your class who say, why do we need to know this, right, about trig? The soldiers wouldn't just respect the authority of this guy. They had to know the reasons behind why you do it this way and not some other way, which I always thought was just like this great little American vignette. The second thing, and I think that this is sort of one of the things you need to grapple with for me, is I think one of the reasons why experts are in such bad odor these days is that too many experts think that their expertise in X has a transitive property that allows them to be experts in Y. And, and like my friend David French will call it, complains about this with billionaires. I've created an electric car. Now let me fix racism. Right. I mean, it's like one skill set does not lend itself to the other skill set and, or the other problem. But you have, or like the thing that drove me crazy during the pandemic were all the epidemiologists and public health officials who said it's too dangerous to let people go to their parents' funeral or their kid's wedding or anything like that. But by all means, congregate in huge numbers to protest racism, because COVID won't infect you when you're protesting racism, right? There is this sense that people are using their expertise to give themselves permission just to boss you around. And I think that would piss off people from any country, but I think it's something uniquely infuriating for Americans about that. And so I'm just a huge champion of staying in your lane. For most people, everyone has a right to voice their opinions and all that kind of stuff, but you don't have a right to say, I'm an expert in nuclear physics, and therefore this is why you're wrong about Fox News, right? That's the sort of problem that we're in.
Yeah. Maybe can I answer? I want to get to the expert issue second. That was the last thing you asked, but because I realized I didn't really answer your piece of your question about the kind of American pragmatism, which your anecdote, the first part of that question, was harkening back to. So maybe just say something about that, which I think will ultimately connect up with the expertise thing. So I think you're right. I think there's a kind of peculiarly American tradition of sort of pragmatism and also, generalism. The idea that, I have a European friend who who lives in the States, and told me that he's Austrian. He said it was shocking to him when he moved to the United States that Americans would do things like work on their cars in their free time if they weren't car mechanics, and not just work on their car. They might, they do a whole host of things that, in a different kind of society, you sort of, well, there are people who are experts in that. So why would I do that? I'm a software engineer, and I think we've always had a tradition of that, right? The sort of the kind of Renaissance man type. But it's interrelated with the idea of self-government, right? Because in order to be a self-governing people, you do have to be engaged in a wide range of things. You can't just defer to others on everything. So those things are, I think, tightly linked. And a piece of that is the sort of embrace of a kind of, pragmatic approach to technology and innovation. And in a certain sense, that pulls very much in the direction of science and expertise, because, we've always been very, as a country, embraced innovation and wanted technology to improve our lives and so on.
We are a gadget friendly people.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I think the interesting, this goes back to the history a little bit, something changes in the late 19th century where science really becomes integrated with lots of domains of life, especially with technology, engineering, medicine, the practical professions, in a way that hadn't been true before. And so suddenly, if you want to be doing things like increasingly, engineering or building technology, you need to have specialized scientific expertise. And the nature of science also became much more specialized. The era of the sort of gentleman astronomer came to a close. And so there was a way in which, by the 20th century, technical expertise, whether it's, natural science or technological innovation, poses a kind of challenge to self-governance in a way and to a degree that it didn't before, or at least it seems to. And there's one other aspect of this that I think is interesting, which is, rival understandings of expertise to a certain extent. And this is something that I think we've kind of missed nowadays, because we just talk generally about experts, or even scientists, where scientists could include, Elon Musk, or, people studying, marine biology, which is that, there's a kind of, I would describe it as a progressive notion of expertise, where expertise is really about trying to use tools of science to make society more efficient or more, rationally based, and to make politics or policy more efficient or rational. And there's also a tradition of thinking about science as a form of knowledge, which is, to pursue knowledge for its own sake. And you can really see both of those elements within the scientific community. And they have interesting kind of tensions and interrelations. And I think sometimes those get kind of run together in ways that kind of muddy the conversation. So I don't know, that's just a few different ways I might kind of get at the first part of your question about the kind of American character and its relationship to expertise. But I think it gets to the second piece, which is the role of experts and the limits of experts. So I would sort of break that into two. I think there's an issue of epistemic limits and the question of the role that experts have in a democracy. So maybe the limits of expertise vis-a-vis other kinds of roles, non-technical expert roles. And they're interrelated but distinct. So in the first piece, it's interesting, right? The idea that there are experts, there are people that have knowledge that others don't. Again, it's a sort of challenge to a kind of thoroughgoing populism where anybody can just know anything. But one of the implications of that, if it's true, that there are people that have specialized expertise that others don't, is that it applies to experts too. And to the extent that expertise becomes more and more specialized, experts themselves become interrelated, interdependent on other kinds of experts, right? So, nuclear physicists don't have any, a priori, any more knowledge of, evolutionary biology than anyone else. Now, they might have the kind of raw materials in order to become an expert about it, because they studied a lot of math or whatever. They're familiar with science in the broad sense. They kind of have a scientific sensibility or whatever. But the scientific community is itself composed of lots of really increasingly specialized areas of expertise, which means not only do experts, not only are non-experts dependent on experts for the things that they know, but experts themselves are interdependent. And this is an important point for thinking about the role of experts in political decision-making and other domains. It's not just politics. Anywhere where we're dependent on experts, kind of being clear about those roles. And so I think one of the things that happened during COVID is the kind of running together of both, where you had a lot of people. I mean, a global pandemic is an interesting kind of crisis, right? It implicates everything. So nobody is an expert on all of it. It's just not possible. But you do need lots of kinds of expertise in order to even get your hands around the problem. And so you have one danger, which is that people who, are experts in data analytics are pontificating about, virology, or people who are virologists are pontificating about other areas of science that they may or may not know much about, or at least any more than anyone else. But simultaneously, I think you have the reality and certainly the perception that scientists, experts generally are assuming, political power or influence in a way and to a degree that's democratically problematic. So that's a problem, not, of epistemic trespassing, right? Of going into another domain that's not your own in terms of knowledge. That's a political problem where experts are empowered either through their own ambition or because of the fact that politicians are happy to outsource the difficult job of politics to experts. They're assuming a political role that is really not properly their own. And that, I think, that's a challenge to democratic institutions anywhere. But I think it's one that particularly grates against modern sensibility, American sensibilities, because of that tradition that we were talking about earlier.
I don't have the sociological vocabulary to articulate the point well, but like the problem with, maybe it's like a little Hegelian or something. It's like the problem with a lot of American traditions is that if it's a strong American tradition, there's also a strong American tradition opposed to it, right? And so there's a strong American tradition of individualism. I think everybody agrees on that. There's also a really strong American tradition of anti-individualism, because you create the thesis invites the antithesis kind of thing, right? So as much as Americans like innovation, they like technical expertise, they respect technical expertise and all that kind of stuff, there's also a tradition of rejecting that kind of thing. And so in some ways, I think back about like the end of the progressive era. Herbert Hoover runs for president in 28, at least partly on the slogan of, do you want an engineer as president or just a politician? Right? He had bumper stickers to that effect. Because back then, engineering was the new hotness, right? Engineering was the solution to all of our problems. I mean, when we say social engineer today, it just immediately has this negative connotation, but people don't remember that it was actually introduced as a positive term, right? It's just because of what the social engineers did with their social engineering that we now think social engineering is bad. I kind of think about like one of the reasons why we have czars for different, agencies, like in the government, is because we keep ruining the brand name for the previous terms we had for these things. And so like, if you look in the late 20s, are you looking in the late 20s through the early 30s, the mid 30s, front page, articles in the New York Times would be about so-and-so named dictator of trade or whatever. And they don't mean it like Hitler. They mean it like what we would say, like the drug czar. They just mean, oh, it's the drug dictator. And like, these words, they get sticky with negative connotations because of what people do with them. And so there's this weird tradition about American democracy. Americans like democracy. We are a democratic people. But in every generation, there's this weird pull to be non-democratic. And I mean, I think part of that is baked into human nature, yada, yada, yada. That's not the point I'm getting at. I just mean like the number of Republican politicians over my lifetime who said that the reason why they decided to run for office is because they think government should be run more like a business, is just enormous, right? You can't run the government like a business. It's not a business. America loves the idea of generals being president. But you can't run the government like it's the military, because it's not the military. And so there is this weird hunger for the thing that we don't like, as much as there's this weird love for the thing that we do like. I mean, you see what I'm saying? And so like, I think this tension between democracy and expertise is baked into the cake. And the pendulum is sometimes going to go too far one way or too far another way. But I don't think this is a surmountable problem. I don't think that you can get the unified field theory where we just get this problem right, because I think the problem is in our hearts and our minds. Am I just rambling now? Does that make sense?
No, I think that's probably right. I was footnote it, thinking as you were talking, czar is really not much better a term for in terms
No.
of right? But we just sort of take that as yeah. So I think that there's a lot of truth to that. That this is a kind of tension that's just ever present, and I think you're also right that in some sense the tension reflects the left-right divide, but in another sense it's within both left and right. And I think that's been true for a long time. And we could think about it as a kind of modern incarnation of the ancient tension between the few and the many, and so on, we were talking about earlier. But I do think something really distinctive happens in a certain point in history, which the progressive era is kind of the culmination of it in a certain way, where you have large scale change happening, professionalization across society. Across, sociologists refer to rationalization, where the sort of older modes of social organization are changing or being replaced or displaced by new ones. The rise of a new professional class, the professionalization of the professions. I mentioned before, the increasing importance of science for medicine, something we take for granted now. That doctors, we kind of think of them as scientists or quasi-scientists, but that was a real novelty and challenge. And physicians, many of them resisted the incursion of science into their professional domain. There's a similar story about engineering. And so by the early 20th century, you have this sort of new class of scientists, professionals. Also at the same time, you have the modern civil service developing. And this poses a kind of new sort of opportunity and challenge, right? So for a lot of the social reformers, as you're indicating, they saw real opportunity to improve things, and progressivism was an expression of that. But I think the dangerous side of that is something that we're still living with, which was maybe the way to kind of summarize it is a kind of reflexive allergy to politics and to political institutions, and the idea that a certain understanding of the professions and certainly a certain understanding of science or scientific expertise could allow us to essentially sidestep politics or replace political institutions with pure rational scientific management. I mean, again, you saw that in the private sector at the time, and you saw it in the public sector as well. And I think that we're in many ways still beholden to that image and its dialectical antithesis. We're kind of still operating in that same space. And, I think on the right side of the aisle, the vision may be more to promote the kind of efficiency of the private sector and the manager and, the military leader, the general or whatever. And on the left side, it's, public health experts or whatever. But there is a similarity there, and it runs in pretty obvious tension with democratic political, a more kind of democratic political sensibility. So I don't know that we're necessarily going to resolve that, but I do think that a starting point for trying to reconcile these things is rethinking the notion of expertise. I think that there's built into that dichotomy often are very contestable and I would say flawed notions of expertise, which maybe heighten the tension, that exaggerate the extent to which these two things are not reconcilable.
So what are like some flawed notions of expertise? I mean, like what specifically do you mean by that?
Well, so I think, this kind of gets, COVID's maybe a good illustration of this. I think.
Yeah, I wanted to steer towards COVID anyway. So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, so one of the challenges, so we think about kind of staying in your lane, right? You could kind of sketch a picture of scientists as, operating over here in a value-free, apolitical way, just pursuing truth. And then there's politics over here. And depending on your picture of politics, it's, irrational forces of self-interest or it's whatever. And these are separate, non-overlapping magisteria. But as a matter of fact, that's not the way the world works at all, right? all sorts of scientific and other kinds of expertise are deeply intertwined with politics, and the political order is, increasingly intertwined and dependent upon scientific expertise and evidence. And COVID's a great example of that, where we have crises that we can't even really understand or characterize without expertise. And so because of that, we're asking experts, implicitly or not, to make judgments about things that go well beyond the kind of narrow area of specialized expertise that they might normally have. And we don't really have the luxury of just allowing experts to, live amongst themselves and think great thoughts. We're dealing with complex technical questions like, how to develop and deploy genetic-based diagnostic tests and develop vaccines and make decisions about, to regulate or not artificial intelligence or whatever. And so we have this kind of hybrid mess. But I think the sort of positive spin on that is that in these environments, experts really they're important, but they're sort of participants among many in complex problems that are not narrowly technical. And so I think, maybe a long-winded way of answering your question, I think one of the flaws in that kind of old progressive view of expertise is that we can use technical expertise to solve political social problems. So the implicit idea there is that those problems are just technical problems. If we just had enough expertise, if we had experts in the right political positions of influence or power, then we could solve these problems. But in fact, these are really complicated problems that are hybrid. They're partly technical, they're partly rooted in value disagreements and worldview conflicts. And so we need experts in those circumstances. And those circumstances are sort of most of the circumstances that modern politics is about. But they're obviously not sufficient for all of the reasons that you indicated before. So I think a kind of humbler view of what expertise is and how it lives in a complex modern society is a first step for thinking about how we can situate it into democratic politics in a way that's not as conflictual.
I'm torn by two competing impulses here. One, I want to go on a stem winder about how scientific expertise is the new Gnosticism. But on the other hand, I want to ask you about Anthony Fauci. So let's start with Fauci. I could feel people switching podcasts as I talked about Gnosticism and scientific expertise. But so I have to admit, I've kind of tuned out the fight over Fauci at this point because the pandemic is over. And I think Fauci made a lot of mistakes. And I think he hung around too long, even though this is probably unfair in some respects to Fauci. He became such a political albatross that he probably just should have gotten out of the way earlier, even if that's unfair. Sometimes you just you attract so much political headache that like you got to take one for the team and sort of retreat to the sidelines. But on the same time, I have a lot of sympathy for Fauci because he didn't run the CDC. I mean, the only reason he came out there was that the guy from the CDC sucked and he wasn't reassuring at all. And everyone was like, oh, where's that guy that everyone knows is like the smart doctor? Let's have him come out and say things that sound confident and reassuring. And so he did. That's what he was asked to do, and he did it. And now he's getting the hell beaten out of him for getting out ahead of the science, when that's exactly what he was kind of asked to do in the first place. And but at the same time, I just think it's really, really bad when you have scientists who should know better, first of all, and I think he should know better, when they say, when you question me, you're questioning the science. And you shouldn't question the science. You are borrowing authority in a way that is just going to piss off a lot of people needlessly. Anyway, what is your take on the Fauci? I don't even know. I honestly don't know what the latest controversy is. I see it on Twitter and I move past at this point. because the people most invested in hating Fauci tend to be like, if you're still screaming about Fauci at this point, you're more likely to have been one of these people who's screaming about how masks are evil, or that, or you may be a small donor to Robert Kennedy Jr. or something like that. And I don't have time to revisit all that stuff anymore. But anyway, so how do you think the history on Fauci is going to be written, if it were written accurately and fairly?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I think you're right. I think so. The public discourse has and maybe rightly, moved on from some of this stuff. But I guess, yeah, I would say a few different things. One is, I think you're absolutely right to make the observation that, first of all, Fauci, he wasn't running the CDC. He wasn't formulating policy in that sense. And you can take this point even further. The CDC has a pretty limited purview in terms of the kind of policy it formulates, right? It's not regulating, school districts. It does have a domain in which it has regulatory authority, but largely what it does is it promotes, guidance, which, lots of people do adopt. So I want to come back to the issue of sort of influence, but you could tell a kind of whole story about COVID that starts from the observation that, in fact, this wasn't ruled by experts at all. I mean, if you look at what was going on during COVID, first of all, a lot of the policies initially, like even lockdowns, were really trailing the behavior of people. I mean, people weren't going anywhere before the shutdowns happened. They were sort of self-shutting down. And, most of the policies, as we all learned, were formulated by people at the county level, at the municipal level, at the state level. I would say most of the stuff that impinged on us on a day-to-day basis the most didn't emanate directly from any federal authority. That's why, living in D.C., we were all aware of that. You can move between D.C., Maryland, and Virginia and have totally different policy regimes. And those decisions themselves, they were made by politicians. The county commissioner who was, looking to the county health board or whatever, to his advisors, but these were political decisions made at different levels of government. And that's a very important fact that I think is often overlooked. And actually, I wrote a piece about this not too long ago. I think if you look at the history of other epidemics, going back, before the rise of this modern expert class that I was describing, the contours of epidemics look surprisingly similar, which is just sort of suggestive of the fact that maybe the dynamics of these sorts of crises have less to do with expertise than we actually think. Politicians make difficult decisions and suboptimal conditions, right? Massive crisis with lots of uncertainty, and they want to promote, sense of security and stability. The quarantine as a response to epidemics, it has it's an ancient policy response, and it's actually been contested, usually when it's implemented. And so, I think there's a certain kind of resetting of the stage there that is important. That all said, there's no question that the CDC is enormously influential. As I said, it formulates guidance, but that guidance is then taken often just as it is by school districts and so forth. So it's very, you can be influential without having that kind of direct power. And same goes with Fauci, right? He wasn't sitting there just making law or policy, but he exerted an enormous kind of political influence, media influence. But you're right that in a sense he was asked to do that. I think sort of you could say in a more nebulous way, like we all wanted that. We kind of asked for it. It's a crisis, and someone's in charge. Someone can tell us, whether it's safe to go outside or not. It's no surprise then that he became a particular lightning rod, in the kind of culture wars that ultimately consumed COVID policy. But that's true of a lot of other things too, like masks, as you mentioned. So I think in thinking about Fauci, I think the right move is the one you made, right? Which is, well, put it this way: the wrong response is to say, Fauci should have we should have never had, an expert who was public facing at all. Experts should just be over here, and politics is over there. That's just not really possible in a crisis like that. And it's certainly not what we were demanding. of experts. We wanted answers. We wanted people to tell us what was safe and so forth. But that's general point is still separable from the specifics about the nature of that role and the way that Fauci filled it. I think I'm kind of two minds about this, but I think something you could say, it's certainly an open question, is whether Fauci was public facing in the right kind of way. Was going on cable news day in, day out necessarily the best way for an expert in an advisory role, in a public facing role, to be doing the reassurance or using his expertise to improve political decision making. In the current kind of media, cultural, political context, maybe not. Maybe that was inviting polarization. And then I think there's the specifics about how he himself slotted into that role. And I think one of the things that he failed on more than any specifics of policy was how he presented the relationship between science and policy, which kind of gets back to my earlier point, the sort of progressive view. Science is this perfectly rational thing which can just be imposed into the political sphere and yield incontestable political decisions, captured in the phrase "follow the science." The best example of that is the debate over masks, where, stepping back from the question of what the science says about masks, what the right political decision was, you just look at what Fauci said over time, over a surprisingly short period of time, and he wasn't the only one. With things like, there's no reason to wear a mask. There's no evidence to support the idea that this is providing any protection, so people shouldn't be wearing masks. And then, within a matter of weeks, it's the opposite policy position. But that's not what's actually. So everyone's focused on the policy change. What's more significant to me is the kind of rhetoric in which the opposite policy in a short order of time was presented. The same kind of certitude. Well, now we've done a meta-analysis, and now we know for sure that masks work. But neither is right? The science in these domains is really complex, and there was, in fact, a disagreement, still is, in the expert community about the appropriate role of what kind of face coverings and what kind of settings. And what had really happened was a combination of things. We learned a lot more about different aspects, things about the virus. We learned maybe a little more about masks, but really a different judgment call was made about the value of this intervention under the circumstances. And rather than just saying, here's the best evidence we have, here's what we're trying to do, this is the best decision we can make under the circumstances. So we're recommending it to political decision makers to make. Instead of saying that, what people like Fauci said was, the science shows this with certainty, and if you argue with it, you're attacking the science. And that was just, in my view, giving tons of ammunition to people that were already distrustful and skeptical. And it helped set in motion this really negative dialectic between kind of extreme technocratic follow the science ideologues on one side and the extreme populist skeptics on the other.
Throughout that entire period, I always just kept thinking of Bill Murray in Ghostbusters, who just tells the guy, "Back off, man. I'm a scientist," right? As if like that's all you need to say. But I do think, I don't need to drag you into punditry, but part of I think Fauci made mistakes, and I think he allowed himself to he listened to his biggest fans too much, which I think is one of the most poisonous things you can do in public life. But I live in a neighborhood that still has plenty of "Thank you, Dr. Fauci" signs up. The thing that bothers me about some of the biggest Fauci critics is they never give any sort of concession to the fact that when a country was going through this massive dislocation, very nervous pandemic, economic uncertainty, all these kinds of things, the president of the United States was not at all reassuring, right? And you have this guy who's up there who says, "Oh, these daily COVID briefings are getting good ratings. Well, give them to me, because that's all I care about is the good ratings." And he takes them from Pence and he turns them into these sort of dumb infomercials, and reality show things that freaks a lot of people out, right? And so you have, Dr. Birx or whatever her name is, and Fauci and these other people being asked to be reassuring to a lot of people who are like, "Oh my God, we got the guy who's supposed to be in the pilot's chair in the cockpit is tweeting like an escaped monkey from a cocaine study. What are we going to do? Right. And so we got to get, these other people had to carry a lot more load. Like if Pence had been allowed to just be the guy, like there would have been more room for Fauci and these other people to be more ambiguous, more subtle in some of their answers, I think. But, anyway, my only point is that people who say, oh, Fauci was this horrible creature and blah, 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 blah. And he said these things that were too declarative and too categorical. And he got out ahead of the science and he changed his positions and all this kind of stuff. I was like, and do you have any of those kinds of criticisms for his boss? The guy who like said, the numbers get 5 now and it's going to go down by next week, and how, the bleach and the and the ultraviolet light and the will be open in the spring because that's a nice date, like whatever. I mean, like like so many institutions, the need not to blame Trump created an imperative to blame other people 10 times as much. And I think that that's one of the things that gets kind of left out of this equation.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think, if you just step back and think about it, why was the head of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, a division within the NIH, National Institutes of Health, who's largely responsible for research, a research division within a biomedical research institution? Why is this guy on TV all this? What is he doing in this role? Why was it even possible for him to assume this kind of public-facing role? And the answer is exactly what you say. I mean, there was a vacuum, and it was filled, and probably could have been filled by worse things. And it was a vacuum created by the lack of leadership by Trump and his administration. I think there's no question about that. I mean, and Trump played this strange game where he was simultaneously in charge of this administration, including all of these agencies, and did to some extent and still does to some extent take credit for aspects of the COVID response, like Operation Warp Speed, the development of the vaccines, and at the same time, played this role of kind of populist victim of the elites, and in stoking skepticism and distrust of the very people that he's actually responsible for in some sense. And just more generally, I mean, that's kind of an overly elaborate characterization of what he was doing. I mean, in just more, cruder sense, he just wasn't, there was no statesmanship, right? And I think that you're absolutely right that this was a moment for statesmanship, and had there been that, it would have also allowed for a better understanding of the role of experts within that, within decision making. Rather than just seeing it as the only option. And I think that there's a real tendency, we could maybe talk about this later, but I think what happened during COVID is a special instance of a more general phenomenon we see, which is an abdication by political decision makers. They didn't want to take responsibility for these decisions. They're controversial and they're hard, and you have to run on them and so forth. It's much easier to say, well, the science says we have to do this. And if it's unpopular, you can say, well, the scientists are at fault. It's tyranny of experts. Whereas in fact, these are political decisions, and we elect people to make political decisions, to listen to experts, but also to do other things. And I think the lack of that is what made these dynamics possible to a large extent. So I think you're absolutely right about that.
And so then you said this other thing about how if you look back at how we responded to other pandemics, it's kind of like all within the margin of error. These things happen all the time, kind of thing. I was I'm sure he wouldn't mind me out on him, but like it's Chatham House rules. It was all supposed to be off the record. But I was at this thing recently where we had a presentation about lessons learned from COVID globally and all that kind of thing. And this guy made the point that if you actually, if you turn off your sort of, the radar that pings things that prove where you get to say, I told you so, right? If you kind of take out your partisan, if you take off your partisan blinders and you just look broadly at the global trends about how various countries responded to the pandemic, it turns out like the difference, you have all these people, including some good friends of mine, who are like, it will be, America will be damned for 1,000 years because we didn't adopt the Swedish model of responding to the pandemic. And then you still have people, I probably bump into 10 of them at Whole Foods every day, who think that we should have been more like New Zealand or Australia, right? I mean, like, And it turns out that if you kind of like account for differences in population and demography, Sweden had a lot of shutdowns. And a lot of them were bottom up shutdowns. Like companies just sort of closed up shop. They didn't necessarily come from an order, but they still didn't have, lots of people showing up. And India had fewer deaths than us. It wasn't because they had a stricter mask regime, or anything like that. It's just because it's a younger population. Maybe they had a slightly boosted, younger, skinnier population, and maybe they have a slightly boosted immune system because they're exposed to more things, whatever. Similarly, Africa, much younger, that's the key to surviving COVID. And you look around and like the delta between like extreme lockdowns and extreme openness, it's actually pretty narrow, as is the sort of the morbidity rate is much more narrow than people think. And there's this and so this actually gets us back to sort of, in a nice serendipitous way, one of our where we sort of started with some of this stuff. We might have talked about this last time you were on here. I know I talk about it all the time. One of my heroes was Seymour Martin Lipset, who's this great sociologist and political scientist. He was actually the head of both the American Political Science Association and the American Sociological Association. No silos there, right? And so anyway, one of his big things was he studied the differences between America and Canada. And one of the great things about, he always used to call it the best natural experiment in political science, because you basically have the same literally the same genetic population to a large extent. For the most part, same language. There's some French speakers up way north, or in Quebec, or whatever. But the main difference between the two populations was one was royalist or loyalist, and one was, ready to like go full tilt boogie for freedom and justice. And you fast forward 200 years, and again, this was Marty's point. He was like, around the same time, both countries said we're going to switch to the metric system. The Canadians said okay, and started talking in that witchcraft. And the Americans were like, screw you. They're called miles. We're not going to do that. And so, yeah, like you expert types, how to do all these conversion things. But for the most part, Americans are like, no, but we're not going to do that. Not just because the government told us to. And I think that so one of the things that Marty always used to say was, if you only know one country, you actually know no countries, because you actually don't understand what makes your country distinct from other countries. And you can only do that in sort of a scientific method of comparison, right? You don't know if you've got the most unusual mouse in the world unless you compare it to other mice. And the same thing with countries. And it turns out that if you compare America's response to the pandemic to most countries that we would want to be like, right? Like obviously we did things better than Russia, or Sudan. I don't know what Sudan did during the pandemic, but I'm just assuming that. And we did within the margin of error, plus or minus, how most of Europe did it, and we made some mistakes. We went too far one way, then we went too far another way, and all that kind of stuff. But it kind of all comes out on the wash a little bit. At least that was his case, and he ran us through a bunch of numbers that it seemed pretty persuasive to me. What do you think of all that?
I think to a certain extent that's true. I think there's a certain point in time during the pandemic when it looked like, well, this country's really figured it out, and if only we were more like South Korea or whatever. And then over time, there were, that country might wind up having problems that we didn't have, and for all the different. It's
kind of like, just to interrupt for 2 seconds, it kind of reminds me of the argument about cars for clunkers. I don't know if you remember this, but like back in the Obama administration, there was this Cars for Clunkers program where government was going to buy up all these old cars. And all it did was it just simply delayed spending that was going to happen anyway, or moved up spending that was going to happen anyway, right? There's a lot of things that happen in the pandemic in different sequences, but it all, it's like most people didn't get COVID until Omicron, but then everyone got Omicron, and there's lots of things that were going to happen over time, just in different sequences. I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, not at all. I think there's a lot of truth to it. I think obviously there are things that we all, for the most part, had the ability to do. developing vaccines, a better understanding of how diseases operate. As imperfect as things were, even in 2020, like we were in better position than Americans dealing with cholera in the 1850s, right? So that's all true. But again, if you look in the historical sweep of things, not just at what different countries did during COVID, there are these kind of demoralizingly persistent patterns of how people respond to epidemics. And so I think to a certain extent, what you say is true. Now, I think, I guess I would say really two things about it. One is it doesn't mean that policy doesn't matter. And part of it is, again, about what the goals are, right? If you remember in the early days of the pandemic with the flatten the curve, the real argument for that wasn't that we want to, it wasn't to arrest the pandemic. It wasn't to prevent all illness and death. It was to slow it so that the healthcare system could absorb the kind of surge of cases and so forth. So that's a very, now the politics very quickly moved beyond that discrete policy objective, but that's a sensible objective, right? And so you just like zoom out, you might say, well, people got cases, people died anyway, but it might have had the healthcare system completely, been overrun, become destabilized in the first few months of the pandemic. I mean, who knows what that would have done, right? So that's a discrete policy objective that's worth kind of thinking about in its own terms. And did we make the right call, the wrong call? We could argue about all of that. So I think, policy still matters. But the second thing, which is the broader point, is look, I mean, these are massive crises, pandemics, right? I mean, they happen historically, but there's no easy choices. There's no obvious answers. And all of the policy decisions require trade-offs, and we're not going to always agree about how to make those trade-offs. And so even this is the point that I've tried to make. It's an unpopular one. I think there's this idea that, well, in hindsight, we're going to look back at COVID and we're going to decide we made the right call or the wrong call. The fact of the matter is that's not going to happen because the very disagreements that drove the politics of the pandemic continue to drive our politics. And we're going to look back at the pandemic through those same lenses. I use this example in a piece that I wrote in the middle of the pandemic, which was a swine flu epidemic that never materialized during the Ford administration that nobody really seems to remember. But the Ford administration launched this massive vaccination campaign. A lot of the modern infrastructure of vaccines actually dates to this effort. A lot of the surveillance programs for safety and so forth. I think it was 70 million Americans were immunized through the program, something like that. And then it turned out that it was a false alarm, basically. And the reaction to the vaccine program was this very redolent of today. People were, pointing to old people dying from the vaccine. The government is motivated by the health security bureaucracy to try to, whatever conspiratorial counter reactions. Ford was politicizing science and all this stuff. But what's interesting is that when experts look at that historical episode now, they still don't agree about what the right response was, because in the moment of uncertainty, what should the president have done? Should he have said, experts, you're probably wrong. There's no epidemic coming. I'm not going to do anything. Or should he have said, we're going to do all these things because the prospect of a 1918 repeat, which is what they were worried about, is so great that, certainly worth the cost of a large scale vaccination program. Was he right? I mean, we still don't agree about that. To the people, at least that know about it, right? I think the same thing's going to happen with COVID. It's still happening with COVID. And so, there's a kind of mirage there that somehow, we're going to settle this issue. But the fact of the matter is that these kinds of crises elicit our kind of deepest worldview conflicts. And that's just the nature of them. And, just on the kind of reaction generally, going back to the history point, outbreaks of infectious disease are uniquely frightening. If you look through the history of public health, that's always been true. People panic. It's frightening. And the public tends to treat diseases like this as inherently infectious and contagious, and they just don't want to be around people that are infected, whatever the experts are saying. I use the example of the 1878 yellow fever epidemic, where experts were divided over how is this thing spread? Is it fomites or is it spread through the air? The public was just like, we're terrified. I'm fleeing. I'm gonna get out of Dodge. I'm gonna stay at home or whatever. And this sort of dynamic sets in motion, and the politicians want to find a way to grapple with that, and there's no good answers, right? And funny little footnote to that too is that it used to be a trope, at least, is very prevalent in the late 19th and to the mid 20th century among public health experts, was that the public was irrational for this, that they would frequently, this wasn't the quiet part, this was said out loud, that outbreaks of infectious disease are far less important in terms of overall public health and mortality and so forth than more mundane causes of disease and so forth. And a lot of the experts in those days were quite explicit that epidemics were a political opportunity to implement reforms that they had wanted all along, because the public was, not entirely rationally so scared of these things. Well, finally, now we can show why we have to have these sanitary policies and build these infrastructures and so on and so forth. So I think there's an extent to which these dynamics are kind of, I don't want to say baked into the cake, but they're surprisingly persistent over time. I think it's a helpful starting place for starting to evaluate how we dealt with COVID. That at least has to be part of the baseline, I think.
One of the things that makes, how to put this, one of the things that makes it possible to avoid ideological or political conflict is actual certainty, right? If we know with 100% certainty, where MAGA physicists and woke physicists alike agree an asteroid is coming to Earth, and it's going to hit us unless we do something, that makes it easy to actually start looking at the problem, right? But the problem is that uncertainty, which is baked into this thing we call reality, is unavoidable, right? So like this swine flu thing in 76. Let's say the experts were telling Jerry Ford, there's a 40% chance this is going to be like 1917, right? I don't know if it was a 2% chance or 100, whatever. But let's just say for the sake of argument, it was. What do you do if you're president, right? So there's a 60% chance we're going to wildly overreact to something and do stuff that we don't need to do. But there's a 40% chance that if we don't do those things, 1 million people are going to die. So of course you're going to go do those things, right? If you're a parent and someone tells you your kid has a 10% chance of dying from X unless you do Y, you're going to do Y. Because people understand that lots of things in life happen 1 out of 10 times, right? But that uncertain. Other people look at those odds and they say, "Oh, you want to do these things? You want to do these things anyway, and you're just using this slim chance of X to be able to do this other kind of stuff," which you then played into with this point about the yellow fever thing, about using the crisis as a terrible thing to waste logic to do the things you want to do anyway. It seems to me, go back to my asteroid and compare it to climate change. If you could actually convince people to have the certainty that a certain subset of our society has about climate change, it would be very easy. It should be very easy. It'd be comparatively easy to do a lot of these transition things that people want to do. But I think reasonably, there are a lot of people who don't believe the certainty. And there are even those people more like me who thinks it's a high likelihood that this stuff is, I think this stuff is real. I mean, the concern is real. The problem is real. But the really deleterious stuff is so far out that I have a different policy response to it than somebody who thinks we should set our heads on fire and do everything to, Greta Thunberg has a panic problem that I don't have. And so my point is that certainty is and this is one of the problems that we get with this problem with relying on experts, is we want the scientists to be certain. But then when you actually talk to actual scientists are like, 5 out of 7 chance, 2 out of 9 chance, it's like, because they don't know, because shit's complicated. So I think that's sort of the essence of the problem, is that uncertainty becomes a Rorschach test, and Rorschach tests lend themselves to ideologically divergent interpretations.
Yeah, I mean, I would stand up and cheer and just say yes to almost everything you just said there. I think that's absolutely right. I think that the reality is sort of, there are varying degrees and kinds of uncertainty. But when we're talking about these complicated political, social, environmental issues, uncertainty is sort of endemic, and it invites the kinds of problems that you're describing. I think that's absolutely right. I think, I guess what I would add is the difficulty is that, well, so I think it's Roger Pilkey Jr., the political scientist, has this concept of what he calls tornado politics, right? So his idea is that, there's always uncertainty, but in certain circumstances, there's a crisis that's just, bearing down on a community. No one's arguing, like, if a tornado is about to hit your town, you're not arguing about, the government's telling me to shelter in my basement and I'm, resisting the tyranny of the expert. You just band together and you deal with the crisis. And he contrasts that with what he calls abortion politics, where the issue itself, the way it's characterized as a problem, or whether it is a problem, is itself divisive, and it draws on fundamental disagreements and worldview clashes and so forth in a way that makes even characterizing or recognizing a shared problem difficult. And I think one of the things that happened with COVID is that it kind of moved from the tornado politics into that abortion politics realm. If the early days of the pandemic were a lot like the tornado idea. It was like, look, we're just going to shelter in place and try to deal with this thing. And then, by spring, summer of 2020, things start to get more complicated. But I think what happens is that as the issue sort of becomes, it's not going away, its complexities become more evident, all of these other factors then come into play. And I think climate is sort of is in a similar place. And I think the only way to deal with that is to understand political decision making and policy responses in the ways that you've described, right? That we have to make judgment calls, and those are going to be informed by evidence. But ultimately, because we're dealing with uncertainty, we have to just make a call, and we're not always going to agree about that. And in fact, the fact of that uncertainty is going to invite the disagreement, precisely because there's no independent standard that we can appeal to. I think the danger, though, is that the problem is that we tend not to talk about politics in those terms. Instead, we ask the scientists for the certainty, or the scientists themselves, or at least the sort of their public-facing allies or whatever, are happy to avail themselves of epistemic certainty because it comes with authority. And so people want to be reassured, and people are happy to speak with authority, and the dynamic plays out in those terms, which gives rise to this sort of dialectic that I was describing earlier. Just to stick with the COVID example a little bit longer, and I think you could make a similar argument about aspects of the climate debate as well. If you think about masks, if you look at especially take the example of cloth masks, where whatever your view about masks, the science is it's complicated at best. Even the most ardent kind of pro-mask people in the medical community prior to COVID weren't really promoting cloth masks. That wasn't really even on the table. Cloth masks were pretty obviously is just reaching for something, in an imperfect set of conditions, right? And if you look at how experts talked about that issue amongst themselves, even in peer-reviewed publications, it's exactly as you described it. It'll be, well, look, we're learning a lot about COVID. We got mixed evidence about masks in general. But here's the thing. It's a simple, cheap, low-cost health policy intervention with very few downsides. The upsides are enormous. We could be stopping, mass death. So obviously, we should recommend that people wear cloth masks, in indoor congregate settings where there's high prevalence. But translate that into the public discourse, that's not at all how anyone was talking about masks. It was science shows X, and if you disagree, then you're an irrational nut job. I think we probably would have had a healthier public discourse, and I think maybe people, less polarization around things like masks, if we just talked about it that way from the get-go and said, look, this is a trade-off. Now, expert might say low cost, few downsides. Parents of, 2-year-old child with autism might say, well, actually, no, there are trade-offs, and I don't see it that way at all. And then you can have a debate. Whereas if you characterize it in terms of certainty, whatever the issue is, you can sort of foreclose that sort of debate, which, maybe under certain crisis circumstances is inevitable and perhaps to some degree desirable under certain, delimited temporary circumstances. But as COVID became sort of more of the norm, I think, again, climate, where we're just living in this realm where this existential threat is out there looming, then we have to have disagreements and debates about the trade-offs and what we're willing to make sacrifices for.
Yeah, and I was hardly alone. Lots of people made this point in the pandemic about how lucky we were, because Yuval, our colleague Yuval Levin was one of the guys who was tasked with actually doing pandemic response planning for the Bush administration, and they kind of expected the next pandemic to be a flu, and so a lot of planning was for a flu, and then turned out it wasn't a flu, but like reasonable guess that it would be a flu, given the avian flus that we've seen and all the rest, and swine flus and blah blah blah. But like, if it had been a really 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 bad flu, and instead killed lots of young people, like lots of kids, kids under 5. I used to say all the time, our politics would be so much uglier. But now I'm not so sure. I think because it gets to this certainty versus uncertainty point. You show Americans a bunch of kids dying, they are going to like fall in line and do what they need to do to protect kids, right? It was in part because of the sort of ambiguous threat of COVID, where kids were among the healthiest, and the most vulnerable were people. And I am not making this argument, but there were a lot of people who did. They were going to die anyway, right? That was a huge part of the argument. They're overcounting COVID because these people, you're in a home with 8 comorbidities and get COVID and you die. They're going to die anyway, blah, blah, blah. It made it possible for people's ideological filters to be much more pronounced. And if you'd actually had a pandemic that was killing babies and little kids and toddlers and that kind of thing, the tolerance for a lot of the BS stuff would have just been much lower. People would just been like, I don't have time for that BS. My kid could die. And I think that's something that it's very hard to plan for, because if we're going to think the next pandemic is going to be like COVID, it may not be. And the politics of a pandemic change with who the victims are. And you could just sort of see a lot of people replaying old scripts and creating a lot of problems as a result.
Yeah, I think I'd like to think that what you say is true. The reason why I'm a little skeptical is that, because uncertainty is everywhere, and it's not all the same, right? So the example that I often use is the debate over vaccines. It's amazing how quickly COVID politics, the political debates we're having during COVID, went from debates over masks, where there was genuine expert disagreement with policy changes and so forth, went from that debate over that to, corrosive skepticism about vaccines, an area of medical science that's very well established. And, early on in the pandemic, there was this idea that, that vaccines as a policy response was kind of like the example you're giving about a pandemic that targets children. Like, on this, we're all going to agree. It works. We know that vaccines work. They're great. And this is an amazing tool. It's going to end the pandemic in the most sort of enthusiastic formulations of that. And of course, the opposite happened. And it became highly polarized. And so people's capacity to sort of fasten on to uncertainty and trade-offs, because there is uncertainty and there are trade-offs, even with vaccines, there always has been. Their capacity to do that, I think, is quite great. And so, I don't know, our politics is so out of whack now that I'm not sure that the situation would have played out that differently if the victims of COVID had been different. I'm not sure. I mean, it's obviously impossible to know, but I have some skepticism.
But no, on the point about the mask thing, about how basically it boils down to what your Jewish grandmother would say about chicken soup. It can't hurt, right? I mean, that was what the scientific consensus was like, there's a possibility it could really help, but there's no possibility it really hurts, right? And I get why epidemiologists would take that position. This is a very bad analogy off the top of my head, but imagine there's some disease that for whatever reason gestates in the top of your middle finger. And one guaranteed way of making sure you don't get sick is by holding up your middle finger like you're saying F you to people as you walk around, right? Like, scientifically, we have a lot of certainty that works, right? It keeps the blood from reaching in and they won't spread and blah, blah, blah. And you only have to do it for a few weeks. But as you walk around life, you just have to be flipping the bird to everybody you see. And that's sort of, by bad analogy, a one way to think about masks. Masks made people really angry to wear them and really angry to see other people in them. And, and like people got sick of me saying on here that I was neither pro-mask nor anti-mask. I was like anti-mask and anti-pro, like the mask extremism drove me crazy one way or the other. And, but like, this gets to the point about expertise. Experts know their thing, but they don't know how their thing is going to interact with 1,000 other variables. And if you had first of all, just some old-fashioned politicians in the room, along with maybe some sociologists or some psychologists, would say, these masks are like a middle finger in a lot of people's faces, and they don't like them. And you're going to get blowback about it. We're going to politicize something that we don't need to politicize. So maybe we should work on the messaging of this a little different than what's actually coming out of here. Would have been a better way to go. But that's the problem when you get with expertise, is like they think because their authority is so absolute, they don't need to take into account what their policy proposals, how they're going to interact with the real world a lot of the time. And that creates that's part of the anti-expert blowback, is people telling people how to do things without any appreciation for how it's going to be received in the real world.
Yeah, it's the uncertainty issue again, right? I mean, the implications of a policy intervention, the possibilities, levels of uncertainty just multiply, right? And this is, in my view, it's a strong, forceful argument for epistemic humility. I think instead, what you often have is, especially, I think, not to brag on public health experts, but there's a history of paternalism in that profession and those fields, and it was on full display during COVID. And it wasn't just skeptics that were critical of this aspect. The presumption was, well, if we tell people that we're not sure, then they won't listen and they won't adopt the policy intervention. And the thing with public health policy interventions is they're public health tools, so kind of everybody in the relevant community has to do it, and often they won't work. That's true for masks, especially if what you're talking about is trying to limit prevalence or limit the spread of a disease. And so the presumption is, well, we have to just, we have to present, air of certainty or whatever, so that people will actually do it. Or another example was the worry that if we told people that masks might work, there's going to be a run on masks, and then the people who necessary, essential workers won't be able to have access to the personal protective equipment that they need. So that's a sort of scientific hypothesis, right? If I say X, people are going to react, in way Y. What was the evidence for that? Frequently there isn't any. It's just a prejudice. It's just an assumption. And I think, well, how did that work out? We tried that whole messaging scheme, and half the country, didn't exactly take kindly to it. And we have a situation where, people aren't wearing masks because they associate it with medical tyranny. Well, how did that work out? It wasn't very good. Just from the purely, kind of instrumental perspective of wanting everyone to adopt this policy so that its benefits accrue to everybody, didn't really work out so well. So I think that it's a problem of, I think you're right. It has to do with not recognizing the boundaries of one's expertise, and also a kind of epistemic hubris. And sometimes those things wedded with paternalism. It's a toxic brew. But I think you're right about that.
All right, so I had you on because I wanted to geek out about illiberalism, and instead we just talked about experts the entire time. But we're like 15 minutes over the hour already, so I'm gonna have to have you back on, and we can talk about that stuff another time. Tony Mills, thanks so much for being on. It's always great to have you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Okay, so Tony has left the studio. In fact, he left the studio a long time ago. We had a technological mishap of, wasn't of biblical proportions because it ended up working out. So it was more like of a, apocrypha proportions, non-Pentateuch proportions. But nonetheless, we were freaked out because Tony's internet connection crashed, and the software that we use, you have to upload the audio is like recorded locally, like on your laptop or your computer, but then it is beamed up to the cloud, but that process got interrupted and we were afraid we just sort of lost it, which has happened to us before. There's a somewhere out reverberating through the universe is an entire episode with Leon Aaron talking about Russia that just vanished, just disappeared. We have no idea what happened to it. So we were worried about that. So anyway, the conversation ended about 5.5 hours ago. I think I'm going to have Tony back to talk about some of the things I planned on talking about, because I want to talk about sort of this liberalism debate or post-liberalism debate. But it's going to be an exciting week. Our next guest is none other than one Jack Butler, and we're going to do it live in studio at AEI, just like the old days. And then got the solo, and then Monday we record the big live event with me, Steve, and Chris Starwalt, which is about sort of the cable media environment and a good deal about Fox. Pretty good news environment for that. I guess we never really got to scientific Gnosticism or Gnostic scientism or whatever, but maybe another time. Apologies for that Russian and the Pine Barrens kind of reference, and then we didn't follow up on it. Do check us out at Dispatch Podcasts on YouTube. Good stuff there. We're building that part of the empire up in due course, and looking forward to seeing everybody at our Houston event later on this year. These meetups are doing, they fill up really, really fast, which tells me that we should do more of them. And lastly, if you're not a Dispatch subscriber, it would be great if you could be. If you really like this podcast, if you like advisory opinions, if you like what we're trying to do, and if you think it's important in any way, it would be great if you showed it by simply becoming a member. I saw an ad this morning for the ACLU, and it's $20 a month, and you get some virtue signaling swag, and allegedly you're saving the Constitution, all these kinds of things, and that's great. I liked the old ACLU better. I had more respect for it than what it's become. But I get it. There are people who agree with what it's doing now, and they want to be associated with it and help it. Well, if you agree with what we're trying to do in terms of both journalism and sort of politics and conservatism and all the rest, becoming a member is a great way to show your support for us. Can you guys hear my dogs howling up there? Wow, I don't know what's going on. I got to go. So anyway. Please become a member if you can. It's not a lot, but if you can afford it, which I think a lot of people can, and it means a lot to us, and it helps us enormously. So with that, thanks again to Tony Mills. Thank you all for listening, and I will see you next time.
No, you won't. This is a podcast.